Hi guys, in today's video we're going to look at how to factorize quadratic expressions, and I'm going to show you two methods using just our bracket method, and we're also going to look at how to turn it into a grouping question like we would have looked at in our previous video. So in this video we're going to go through a couple of examples relating to factorising quadratic expressions. Firstly, just make sure you are aware with the definition of a quadratic expression so that you know how to spot it in your exam. So question number 1, we have x squared plus 7x plus 10. The first thing that you're going to do in this question is to look at your plus 10, and you're going to ask yourself what two numbers multiply to give you plus 10. So if we take over to the right hand side, we can say, okay, the number 2 multiplied by 5 gives you plus 10. The number minus 2 and minus 5 gives you plus 10 when you multiply them. 10 multiplied by 1 equals to 10, and minus 10 multiplied by minus 1 would also equals to plus 10. Once you've done that, you're going to look to the number which is in front of your x coefficient, and that is plus 7. So you need to ask yourself, out of those numbers on the right hand side that we've just written down, which of these will add together to give you plus 7? And out of all of these, the only two numbers that will add together to give you plus 7 is 2 and 5. You've basically done all of the hard work. Now all we need to do is set up our double brackets. So the equal sign goes underneath. We draw our two double brackets. We have to split up the x squared between each bracket, x and x. And then we just have to put in the answers that we've come up with already, which is plus 2 and plus 5. Now, what I would always recommend to check is that you draw your two smiley faces. And then you ask yourself, 2 multiplied by x gives you 2x, and x multiplied by plus 5 gives you plus 5x. And when you add those together, you get plus 7x, which is your term in the middle of your quadratic, which is what we are looking for, so we know that we've done it correctly. So in this example, we're going to pretty much do it the same way we looked at example number 1, but I'm going to show you how we can turn this into a grouping question like we would have looked at in our previous video when we were looking at gang of 4 questions. The grouping method is a really nice way of doing factorising for quadratics, because it allows us to use all of the same skills that we've used in previous examples, and it also makes it a little bit easier to work with when we have coefficients in front of the x squared. So we're going to start this one off the same way by looking at our number that is by itself, that's not connected to our x or our x squared, and we're going to think to ourselves, what two numbers multiply to give us minus 22? Now what I'm going to do to start off with is I'm just going to think about what numbers give me 22. So I know I've got 1 and 22, and I've got 2 and 11. So at this stage we think, okay, there are two options. However, because it's a minus 22, that means that one of those numbers would have to be a plus and one of them would have to be a minus, because obviously for two numbers to multiply to give us a minus, one would need to be a plus and one would need to be a minus. So I'm going to use that then to help us with the next step. So then we're going to have a look, like we did in the previous example, at plus 9x. And we're going to say to ourselves, okay, what combination of those numbers and those signs, plus and minus, will give me an answer of plus 9x? So we're basically trying to use these numbers over here on the right hand side to try and come up with a representation for plus 9x. So I'm thinking the 2 and 11 is probably going to help me, because the difference between 2 and 11 is 9. But then I'm thinking, okay, remember, one of them has to be a plus and one of them has to be a minus. So because I need plus 9x, that means that the bigger number is going to be the plus and the smaller number is going to be the minus. Now this is our slightly different step compared to what we did in the first example. So instead of just going straight in now and filling out our double brackets, what I want you to do is I want you to rewrite 9x in terms of these numbers that we've selected over here on the right hand side. So we're going to rewrite 9x plus 9x as minus 2x plus 11x. So I'm literally just using the two numbers that we decided would work to give me plus 9x, and we are re-representing 9x in terms of those two algebraic terms.
So then what I'm going to do is I'm just going to rewrite everything else that's to the left and the right hand side. So I'm just going to write down my x squared and I'm going to write down my minus 22. And now this is a gang of 4 grouping question. So now we're just going to go back to what we learned in the previous video of how to factorise by grouping using gang of 4. So what we do is we take the first 2 terms and we check if they have something in common, and we're going to pull out their common factors. So I can see what's in common between x squared and minus 2x would be x. So I'm bringing x to the outside and I'm saying, what do I times x by to get x squared? It's going to be x. And what do I times x by to get minus 2x? It's going to be minus 2. Then we go and rewrite that second bracket again, and hopefully if we've done this properly, we should be able to pop something in here that will then multiply by that bracket to give me plus 11x minus 22. And the number that's going to work in there is going to be plus 11, because plus 11 times x gives me plus 11x, and plus 11 times minus 2 gives me minus 22. And then again, like we've already learned, we take the terms on the outside of the brackets and we put them into one bracket, and then we take the other bracket and we write that down once, and they're all multiplied by each other. So while the method 1 you might see is a little bit quicker, and this would have been the way I would have always kind of taught and learned factorising quadratics when I first started teaching, but what I've come to realise is while this method takes a little bit longer, and maybe for a question like these where there's nothing in front of the x squared, you know, you might end up doing it quickly and doing it this method. But this second method that I'm showing you here using grouping is really, really useful when we come to look at examples where there are coefficients in front of the x squared. So I'm going to show you one of those examples now. Okay, so looking at our next example, I'm calling this a slightly more challenging example, and the reason for that is because we have a coefficient or a number in front of my x squared. So this is where I would really recommend using our second method that I showed you there on grouping to help us do this question, because it just takes a lot of the hard thinking out of it rather than doing it by just the bracket method. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the number in front of the x squared, and we're also going to look at the number that is by itself, okay, that the constant that is not attached to the x or the x squared. And the first step that you have to remember in a question like this is I want you to do 3 multiplied by 8, okay, so that's the kind of trick that you need to remember to get this started. So 3 times 8 is the first thing that we're going to calculate, so that's going to give me 24. Now 24 is the number that we're now going to use to come up with the 2 numbers that multiply to give you that number. So normally in the questions where there's no coefficient in front of the x squared, you are doing 1 times this number. So that's why we always just kind of look to this number that is not attached to the x or the x squared. But in this case, there is a number in front of the x squared. So our first step is we have to do 3 times 8, which gives me 24. And now this is the number that we're going to ask ourselves, okay, what 2 numbers gives me 24? So a few different options would be 1 and 24, 2 and 12, 3 and 8, 4 and 6. I think that's all of them. And then what we're going to do again is say to ourselves, okay, that is a plus 24, so what two signs would I need to have? And because they're both plus, it would mean that they're both going to be plus or they're both going to be minuses, because if you want to get positive 24, it would mean that these 2 numbers would both have to be plus, or they could actually both be minus. For example, minus 2 by minus 12 would give you plus 24. So that's our first step. So now we need to go, like we did in the previous example, and we're going to do this using the grouping method. So I'm going to look to this number in here, plus 14, and I'm going to see, is there one of those groups of numbers on the right hand side where I can split plus 14 up into 2 numbers that represents it. And very quickly we can see 2 and 12 is going to work here. And because it's plus 14, that means that they're both going to be pluses. So now we're going to come like we did in the last example, and we're going to split plus 14 up into plus 2x and plus 12x. And then we're going to write everything else down to the left and the right hand side. And now we're back into another grouping question. So we're going to take our first 2 terms and we're going to say, what do they have in common? And we can see they have an x in common. So that's going to give me 3x plus 2. I'm going to rewrite that bracket down. and I'm going to say to myself, okay, what do I multiply 3x plus 2 by to get 12x plus 8? And that is going to be a plus 4 will work. Then I'm going to come along and take the terms on the outside of both of those brackets and put it into my first bracket and rewrite the second bracket. Now, as always, you can do a quick check here to make sure you've done this correctly. So if we do our smiley faces, so 4 by 3x gives me 12x, and x plus 2 gives me 2x. And we can see there that 12 plus 12x plus 2x will give me my plus 14x. And obviously you can multiply the entire bracket out if you wanted to be double sure that this is all correct as well. But I would really recommend using that grouping method now, particularly when we have a coefficient in front of the x squared. Okay, so let's look at another example here. So we're being asked to factorise this quadratic, 6x squared minus 17x plus 5. So again, when you see this in your exam, when you're being asked to factorise something, you need to ask yourself what type of factorising question is it, and once you figured out that it's a quadratic, what you're going to say to yourself is, okay, for quadratics, I basically have to go and turn it into a gang of 4 grouping question, and then I'm going back and using that method to help me. So our first step is we always take the coefficient in front of the x squared and the term that has no x variable, and we multiply them by each other. So 6 multiplied by 5 gives me 30. Then we go and we work out what two numbers multiply to give me 30. So we have a few options here. We have 1 and 30, we have 2 and 15, we have 3 and 10, we have 5 and 6. And then we ask yourself, okay, because we are trying to come up with two numbers that multiply to give us plus 30, we say to ourselves, what two signs would I have? So the two options are, well, they both could be pluses, but also they both could be minuses, because minus 1 times minus 30 would in fact give me plus 30. So then we're going to hold that thought for a minute, and we're going to come back over to our quadratic, and we're going to look at the term that has x. And we're going to try and split minus 17x up into two separate terms using our guide number on the right hand side. So we need to ask ourselves now, which combination of numbers that I have written down on the right hand side will add together to give me minus 17. So the first thing we're thinking is obviously 2 and 15 seem to be on the right track, but then we need to just select whether they're both pluses or they're both minuses. So because it's minus 17x, we can very quickly see that they both have to be minuses. So now let's rewrite minus 17x as in the two terms. So it's going to be minus 2x minus 15x. Then we'll rewrite everything to the left and the right hand side. And now we go about grouping and factorising it that way. So we take our first two terms and we take out what's in common. So there's a 2 in common and there's an x in common. Then we say to ourselves, what times 2x gives me 6x squared? That's going to be 3x. And what times 2x gives me minus 2x? Be really careful of that. That's just going to be minus 1. Sometimes students say to me, oh, but it's the same thing, so I don't write anything down. If it's the same thing, you write down 1, because it needs to multiply by the 1 to get the same term. And obviously the fact that there's a minus in there as well, we need to make sure that it's minus 1. Then we go and rewrite down that bracket, and we ask ourselves, well, what number do I put on the outside that this bracket will be multiplied by to give me minus 15x plus 5? And the answer is going to be minus 5, because minus 5 times 3x gives me minus 15x, and minus 5 by minus 1 gives me plus 5. So our last step then is to rewrite the two numbers on, or the two terms on the outside into your first bracket, and then we rewrite our second bracket. And again, if you wanted to do a quick check, you could do your smiley faces to make sure that you're getting minus 17x in the middle. Or as I said previously, you can multiply out the entire bracket if you are interested in checking to make sure that you factorise this correctly.
Okay guys, so if you want to have a quick go at these 4 questions, factorising each of them, and then you can, we'll pause the video, have a go at them and play it at the end.
So hopefully you've had a chance to try these questions, and let's go through the solutions nice and quickly. So for my first example, we can see there's nothing, well, there's an invisible 1 in front of the x squared, so 1 times 9, so we're just working with 9 for this one. So we're asking ourselves, what two numbers multiply to give me 9? So it's going to be 3 and 3, or 1 and 9. And the fact that it's plus, it means that they're both going to be pluses or they're both going to be minuses. So then I come into my term on the inside, which is plus 6x, and we can very quickly see that the 3 and 3 and the plus are going to work. So I'm going to separate my 6x out into plus 3x, fill out everything else to the left and the right hand side, and do our factorising. So that is going to give me x bracket x plus 3, and then we're going to pop a plus 3 on the outside. So then altogether then our answer is x plus 3 bracket x plus 3. Same for the next one then, we have an invisible 1 in front of the x squared, so it's just 1 times minus 30, so that's going to give me minus 30. So that's what we're going to be using to work with. So we ask ourselves, okay, what times two numbers times by itself gives me 30 to start off with? So it's going to be 3 and 10, 5 and 6. And then because it's minus 30, it means one has to be a plus and one has to be a minus. So then we come to our term, our x term, and we see that it's minus 1x. So we need to think to ourselves, what combination of those numbers would add or subtract to give me minus 1? So 5 and 6 seems to be the one that's going to work for this one. So then we're going to come down here and we're going to split minus x up into 5x and 6x. But remember, one is a plus and one is a minus. So we need the bigger number to be the minus here so that it gives me minus 1x. So that means it's going to be minus 6 and plus 5. We'll pop in everything to the left and the right hand side, and we go and do our factorising again. So that's going to be x bracket x plus 5. Rewrite down my second bracket and say to ourselves, what times x gives me minus 6x? It's going to be minus 6. And then thankfully minus 6 by plus 5 also gives me minus 30. So our final answer is going to be x minus 6 bracket x plus 5. Okay, moving on to example 3 then. So this time we need to be careful because there is a number in front of the x squared. So our first step, remember, is we have to do 3 multiplied by minus 4, which gives me minus 12. So minus 12 is going to be the number that we're going to be working with for this question. So again, think about what two numbers multiply to give me 12 to start off with. So it's going to be 2 times 6, 3 times 4. And then because it's minus, that means one's going to be a plus and one's going to be a minus. So then we'll come over here, we have a plus x. So remember, that means that's a plus 1x. So which one of these two numbers have a difference of 1? It's going to be 3 and 4. So then we say to ourselves, okay, if I split plus x up into 3x and 4x, which one needs to be a plus and which one needs to be a minus? Well, we want the bigger number to be a plus because it's plus 1x. So that means minus has to go with the 3x. So then we'll come down here. I'm going to have 3x squared minus 3x plus 4x minus 4. And we'll go and factorise. So that's going to be, pardon me, we need to put the x on the outside as well, don't we? So it's going to be 3x bracket x minus 1. Rewrite that down again and say to ourselves, what do we multiply x minus 1 by to get 4x minus 4? And that's going to be plus 4. So therefore, our final answer is 3x plus 4 bracket x minus 1. Okay, and our final example then, we go and we see that there is a coefficient in front of the x squared. So we have to do 2 times 9 to start off with, which gives me 18. And then we're going to go and work out, well, what two numbers multiply by each other give me 18? So that is going to be 1 times 18, 2 times 9, 3 times 6, and I think that's it. So then we say, okay, what do we need to figure it out? It's going to be plus 18. So that means that they're both going to be pluses or they're both going to be minuses. So then we come on into the middle and we look at our x variable. And we can see that there is a 9 in front of the x variable, so it's plus 9. So we're trying to think about what combination of those numbers on the right hand side would add to give me 9. And we can see 3 and 6 seem to work. Because it's plus 9x, they're both going to be pluses. So now let's split the 9x up into 3x and 6x. Write everything else down. And go and do our factorising once more. So I'm going to take x on the outside. And then I'm going to rewrite down that second bracket. We say, what do I multiply 2x by to get plus 6x? That's going to be plus 3. And 3 times 3 gives me 9. So then my final step then is take the two terms on the outside and bring it into one bracket and write down my second bracket. And as always with any of those examples, guys, you can do a quick check using your smiley faces, or if you're kind of unsure of something, you might have done something wrong, you can always multiply it out as an extra check as well.
So in today's video tutorial, we looked at what a factor is and how we can use it to understand factorising quadratics, and we discovered how to factorise quadratics.